How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
Just a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
I wonder if Gary's going to start our series on the beloved children's entertainer Jim Henson with just a series of F-bombs like he did our Iron Giant episode.
Weirdly enough, I did have that thought. Like I was like, should I just go and get it out of the way?
Or do we keep this one clean so that the children can listen?
Yeah, or do I try to honor Jim's memory and just say like, gosh darn it.
Gosh darn it. Every time we feel the need to curse in this episode, we'll just say, what would Jim Henson do?
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to remember in the biography they mentioned like what his normal word was, and I can't remember it now, man.
It's something real corny. It is like gosh, it's not even gosh darn it. It's like gee willikers or something like that.
That it's either that or we get a revolver and blow one of our heads off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every episode of this series is going to end with one of us exploding. that's just how you end a Muppet episode.
Exactly.
Oh man. So okay. Well, anyway, you guys ready?
Oh yeah. You thought we were going right into it, didn't you?
No, I
But
didn't.
I didn't do the intro. This thing starts with me. Well, hello and welcome to Cinema Shock. It's the podcast exploring the stories behind your favorite cult and genre films. We do all the research so that you don't have to. This is the last podcast you'll ever need about Jim Henson. I'm one of your hosts, Gary Horne. It's time to play the music.
And I'm your other host, Justin Bishop. It's time to light the lights.
And I'm writer comedian Mr. Todd A. Davis. It's time to get things started with our first episode in our new series we're calling Heartfelt, the legacy of Jim Henson.
I just want to say up top, I hated that intro. Like I didn't want to do it, but then I also appreciated how passionate Todd was about this. So I didn't want to let him down. So I went with the Muppet Show intro.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your wordplay on the title of the series as well, Todd.
As always, I
clever.
try to contribute where I can.
It's clever. So for this series, we're going to be covering one of the most beloved public figures of all time, a man who spent his career bringing joy to millions. While his career was structured around puppetry, an art form largely seen as something for children, he was more than just a children's entertainer. Although most of us were exposed to his work via Sesame Street, he also created works that skewed darker, more satirical, and much more experimental than many people might realize. But at the center of all of those stories that he told, whether they were kid-friendly educational shows or fantasy adventures filled with goblins and monsters, there was always a lot of heart. So in this series, we are really honored to tell the story of the life and creations of the one and only Jim Henson.
We don't really have anything to spoil here, so we're just going to get into it.
No spoiler. There's not really anywhere to put like a trailer or anything either.
Yeah.
So I guess one thing we should tell our listeners on this one is that this is going to be a little bit different than our other series. You know, normally we do basically one movie per episode. It's kind of like our focus. We'll tell the story about the filmmaker in that era of when that film was made or whatever. But we felt like to do Jim Henson justice, to do his story justice, we needed to tell his whole story. And the truth is, he made the Muppet movie in 1979. He'd already been creating with the Muppets for 25 years at that point. So there's a lot of ground to cover before you ever even get to the Muppet Show. So this is going to be a kind of a different series than what we've done before. At least the first couple of episodes are going to be a little bit different because we just felt like if we really wanted to tell Jim Henson's story, we needed to start from the beginning and we needed to tell his entire story. Because what's interesting when you get into his life and his career, because he started so young, is that there really is like a direct line from like the very first things he was doing to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. They all built upon it. So you'll see like, you'll see the seeds and the beginnings of things that you're going to see 30 years later, even in his early work. So to skip over that, I think we would not be telling his full story. And as Gary said at the beginning of the show, this is the last podcast you'll ever need about Jim Henson. So in order to truly fulfill that statement, we need to tell you everything.
And I'm going to go ahead out on a limb here and say that of everyone that we've covered so far, it feels like, along with everything that Jim Henson has done, because of all of that stuff, there's the most information to find about Jim Henson, probably than any other filmmaker we've covered. Like I said,
I would probably agree with that. And the fact that his family has kept such extensive archives of his work, and he kept like everything, and he kept his old notebooks and sketches and everything.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, he made notes about events that happened. Like, he just marks it all down. So
the Jim Henson, the famous red book, it was his form of a diary, sort of. But like the archives for the Jim Henson legacy are so extensive that there's a lot of stuff out there.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's a good segue into telling y'all who we use for our sources on this episode, and really for this entire series. These two books that I use as my main sources, really one was a main source, the other one was sort of a secondary source, will probably be used throughout the entire series. But the main one, and I know Gary's been going through this one as well, is simply called Jim Henson, the Biography by Brian J. Jones, who's a fantastic biographer. He also did George Lucas's biography, which is really good. It is extensive. And it is very well written. If you are interested at all in Jim Henson, even beyond what we're able to fit in this episode here or the next couple of episodes, like if you want to really get into the nitty gritty, I highly, highly recommend Brian J. Jones's book. It is a very good read. The other one that I use, this was actually a Christmas gift from my wife this year. And it is called, I will hold it up for the camera for those on Cinema Shock Plus. It is called Imagination Illustrated. It's written by Karen Falk, who is the curator of she's in charge of the Jim Henson, or the Henson, the vaults, basically, like all that is her job. And so she's put this thing together, and it's essentially, it didn't give me a lot of information that wasn't already in, the Brian J. Jones book, but it's got pictures of all of his sketches, his notes from the Red Book, and the corresponding, storyboards, photographs, all this stuff from his archives that he kept. It's all in this book, and it is a fantastic read for anybody who is interested in Jim Henson. I highly recommend it. They just came out with actually a new edition of it just a few months ago. It originally was published in like 2012, but a new edition came out in 2024 to coincide with the release of Jim Henson Idea Man, the documentary about Jim Henson that came out on Disney Plus, which I think we all watched as well, which I'm sure we will talk about. But yeah, another one that if you just want some supplemental material and you want to visually see all the stuff that we're going to be referencing during the next couple of episodes, check out Imagination Illustrated. It is fantastic. The fact that it has Sam and Friends on the cover and not just the typical Muppets tells you that this is like for real Jim Henson nerds. Like
deep cuts.
Yeah, it's very, very good. Before we get going, though, I do want to mention we've got another Cinema Shock Plus subscriber to give props to. So this is Asotirov, Asotirov, Asotirov. I guess that's how you say it. It's like a username. I don't think that's
no way to keep a subscriber like butchering their name, Justin.
Well, it's not. I don't think it's their real name. I think it's just the username they put in. But so keep that in mind if you're joining Cinema Shock Plus. The username you put in, the display name is what we're going to read here on the air. So, Sotarov, thank you for joining Cinema Shock Plus. You will get access to the extended versions of these episodes. Cinema Shock Plus subscribers can also not only get extended versions of the episodes, but of course the video versions. The extended versions of these first couple episodes are going to be a little bit weird because they're going to be structured a little differently, but I think we can probably get creative with them and still offer some pretty fun stuff. And of course, you've got the Twin Peaks watch along series that's coming out. We should be a couple episodes of that are out now, with more on the way. We're trying to release those staggered in between regular episodes. So if you're a Cinema Shock Plus subscriber, at least while we're doing the Twin Peaks thing, you'll have new content every single week instead of every other week. So there's all kinds of reasons to join Cinema Shock Plus. The least of which, or I guess the best of which, I don't know the proper way to say this, but you're supporting the show and you're supporting the work that we do and showing your appreciation. And we appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you. You.
Everybody.
Thank you, Sotarov. I don't see your name.
Sotarov.
I'm gonna thank you. I appreciate you.
Yes, thank you very much. And if you are not a member of Cinema Shock Plus and you want to join, head to cinemashock.net/plus and become a member. It's like $3, $5, $10 a month, depending on how much you want to spend. $5 to $10 seems to be the sweet spot for most people. Just depends on if you want to see that video with our dumb faces on it. Look at, and look, Gary's giving a thumbs up right now. And if you're not watching it on the video feed, Todd's dancing. Todd's taking his pants off right now. See, the thing is that, he really is. Wait.
This is the part where I tune out.
Back to the audio feed only. So, one more bit of business before we move on. I would want to mention our next live event very quickly. Our next cult class is happening on January 21st at Coffee Underground in Greenville, South Carolina. It's another collaboration with our friends at Gut Punch. Tickets are on sale now. And for this one, we are showing Who Killed Captain Alex, which is Uganda's first ever action movie. It is a sight to behold. It is one of my favorite things to show to people who have never seen it, and I cannot wait to watch it with a crowd. It is a delight, and I love it. And I'm excited for Gary and Todd to see it because they've never seen it.
Yeah, I'm excited.
And I think most of the people who are in the room have never seen it. I know Aaron, who is our friend over at Gut Punch, has seen it, and they are a big fan of it, and with good reason. It's a fantastic, fun time. So check out cinemashock.net, go to the events page on there, and you can find a link to buy tickets and all that, or you can buy them at the door the day of on January 21st. Coffee Underground, Greenville, South Carolina. Join us if you want to see our dumb faces in the flesh. You'll be amazed by how ordinary looking we are.
Yeah, or how much Todd looks like a Muppet.
Honestly, of the three of us, Todd does look the most like a Muppet.
You know what? Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment.
It's not just like your look; it's your aura, it's your energy. You have big Muppet energy.
Oh, thanks, guys. I do appreciate that.
All right, so let's get into it. Let's talk about Jim Henson. James Maury Henson was born on September 24th, 1936 in Greenville, Mississippi, to Betty and Paul Henson. Jim was the youngest of two children in the Henson family. He had a brother named Paul who was 4 years his senior, and Jim's early childhood was spent in nearby Leland, Mississippi. The Hensons were a very close-knit family, and very early on, Jim developed a strong bond with his grandmother, Sarah, known affectionately to her family members as simply Dear, which I think is a great grandmother name, honestly. Yeah. Jim's relationship with Dear was really instrumental to his growth as an artist and an entertainer. Dear encouraged Jim to draw and paint at a very early age, and even taught Jim to sew, which was a skill that would obviously come in handy in his future career.
Yeah.
I love the stories of the biography of just like people from his past that they're just like telling just how already creative he was. Just there was one story about the kid telling about how they were playing like from a cowboy show they were watching, and the villain had like a tattoo of a star on his hand or something, and like that Jim made like a perfect like tattoo or something to like put on his hand, and like it just, I don't know, it sounds silly, but like it just, you could tell everybody just knew immediately like there was something different about him.
Yeah. He had a natural talent and a natural like creativity, like just born with it, it seemed like.
Considering I don't feel like either of his parents struck me as people that would produce someone very creative.
Yeah, but I mean, it did run in the family. Like Dear was very artistically inclined.
Sure, Dear, yeah.
And her father was like a map maker, illustrator, so he was an artist as well. So there were artists on, in the family lineage for sure. But yeah, his dad worked for like the Department of Agriculture, I think. Like, so
right,
not a particularly artistic field.
And his mom's a Christian Scientist,
right? So. Yeah. So most importantly, Dear provided Jim with an audience. She encouraged him in his play and dressing up, making props. She indulged in his love of bad puns and practical jokes. And by encouraging him, she provided Jim with the self-confidence to believe that he could do and be anything that he wanted to be.
Gary, do you remember your first audience? Because if you get into like a lot of performers, there's all kinds of stories of actors, singers performing for the family and for, even a specific family member. Do you have a memory like that? Was there someone in your family that you, for lack of a better word, performed for?
Well, it depends. Like if it was my early porn career, I
was wondering how we were going to bring in Justin's mom. So yeah.
Hey, we were keeping this family friendly here today.
we'll
It is
figure out more ways.
It's impossible. We do our best.
Yeah, I don't think I have like a memory of like a specific first audience. I remember my family was pretty encouraging of anything, like, you know, if I wanted to play guitar and sing a song or something like that, you know, of listening. And no, nobody was ever discouraging of me.
Justin, I know your dad is a musician. Did any of that? Did any of his performance kind of influence you one way or another?
No, not really. I mean,
No?
me and my dad are very different personalities. My dad's very much an extrovert, and I am not.
Yeah, but you're so good at this, though.
Yeah, this is different, though. This is different. Get me in real. You meet me in real life, and I'm not going to talk this much. I save all of my talking for the podcast.
I definitely remember like just being very playful with my mom. I remember my mom being, if I had to narrow it down to one person, I think my mom was probably my first audience. It's interesting to see how that works with performers, you know, performing for an audience of one and slowly building that audience.
Well, it always instills some confidence if there's somebody who is encouraging you, especially in things that you're actually good at. I mean, there are plenty of people who have been encouraged at things that they're not actually good at, which is why the first episode of American Idol is always so hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
Because people are like, nobody told them they shouldn't be doing this. Nobody told them no. Their mama encouraged them when they shouldn't have. But, you know, when somebody is actually truly talented and somebody recognizes that early on, yeah, it has an impact on you because you believe, hey, this is something I should continue doing and I'm going to continue doing. So the Henson family eventually moved. They relocated to University Park, Maryland, which is a suburb near Washington, D.C. And as Jim grew older, he became a little bit of a gadget geek. He got into gadgets. He got into building model airplanes and crystal radio sets, things like that. The radio, in fact, became a very important entryway into the world of entertainment for Jim. As a young kid, he would rush home to hear shows like The Green Hornet and The Shadow, although his favorite was a show called The Chase and Sanborn Hour, which featured a ventriloquist named Edgar Bergen and his dummy Charlie.
It must be nice. It must be nice to have family who support you or friends that support you, Todd. And one day you can become like a Tuvan throat singer and not have people laugh at you when you tell them about it. I like hearing this stuff about Jim Henson because like it seems like it's going back to the tattoo thing. One of the quotes that just came to me as you were saying that is they felt like he also knew he was extraordinary, but in a quiet way, like that he was meant for something bigger,
Yeah.
you know. So he likes this show, and I just wanted to point out this was before we all discovered that ventriloquist dummies are possessed by evil spirits that are looking to murder you. Just keep that
Potentially, not all of them. They're just they just make a good vessel.
right. They're the perfect vessel for demons.
Yeah. That doesn't mean that every ventriloquist dummy is possessed. It just means they all have the potential to be.
Right.
The great crossover, like for the Venn diagram, is that both are great with educating children.
The likelihood of being killed by a ventriloquist dummy is low, but never zero.
I also enjoyed too. I wanted to mention, like you were talking about all these shows, another kid thing that I remember about him from the biography was that because as I put out bird seed today for my birds because I'm a bird man now, an old bird man.
You're officially old, Gary. Do you have a bird buddy yet? That's the next step.
I do. I got one for Christmas. As a matter of fact.
Are you old bastard?
I did. I haven't set it up yet, but I can't wait. It's gonna be exciting. But so Jim Henson also apparently enjoyed watching birds too. They mentioned in there that his favorite bird was the blackbird, and it was because it was called the grackle, and that's like the name for the blackbird. Yeah,
it sounds like the name of a Muppet.
Yeah, well, that's where I was going with that. Is that, you know, it was just because it was a funny name, but it sounds like it means something. And
yeah,
that stuck with me because I'm like, that's interesting. And I was like, and it's probably why they mentioned it in the book, of course, but his early ideas for getting a weird fucking name that sounds like something.
Yeah. As odd as it was, you know, the show that he listened to, Chase and Sanborn, like I said, the star was a ventriloquist, but it's on the radio, so you can't see the ventriloquist, which is weird, but hey, he became very popular. What struck Jim most about it wasn't his ventriloquism because he can't see the performance. And apparently the guy actually wasn't a very good ventriloquist as far as like not moving his mouth and stuff, but it didn't matter because he was on the radio. What struck Jim about it was the way that Bergen would alternate between characters during the show, bringing them to life purely through the sound of his voice, which is, of course, a skill that Jim himself would use later in life. But then in 1949, a new invention came into Jim's life that would have a much bigger impact on him than radio ever did. It would probably have more impact on Jim's life than maybe anything else. And that invention was television. So once the Henson family bought a TV of their own, egged on by the constant begging from Jim, by the way, he just bugged his dad until he finally bought one, because TVs were really expensive when they first came out. Like, they were not for everybody. Like, they were incredibly expensive.
Major home appliance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they finally bought one, and he immediately became obsessed. He watched it religiously. And it became clear to Jim very early on that television was his future. Like, once he watched it, he was like determined that no matter what it took, he was going to one day work in television.
I love it when people find their passion like this and they just get determined to do something and nothing's going to stop them. It reminds me of like when Justin's mom found out people could be porn stars online.
Wow.
It just,
wow.
Oh,
it's like there was no stopping her.
That's the name of one of her videos, isn't it?
Man, family friendly out the window.
Yeah, we're done.
10
we're done
minutes
now.
in.
Now we're talking real Muppet shit. It's Justin's mom has a Muppet. Anyway, there was something I really meant to say there, but I lost it. I guess I was going to mention too, it just came to me as you were talking about it, just like how he was mesmerized about the guy's ability to work the puppet and switch back and forth, because we'll talk more about this, I guess, probably in an episode involving Sesame Street, that like I was mesmerized as a small child by Muppets, thinking that they were like another race of beings.
Yeah,
and
I mean, that's the magical thing about them, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that, but they felt real.
Well, and I was going to say is that just even now researching this, it was blowing my mind watching Jim Henson sit there in interviews, and sorry to take us off on a tangent, but just watching him communicate with interviewers or anybody and have like Kermit there. Mm-hmm. Even those people, you could tell they felt okay with looking at Kermit when Kermit's talking. Like they're talking to Kermit.
Yep.
Like I saw him on like Arsenio Hall, and Arsenio Hall's having a conversation with Kermit, and it's just,
even though Jim is sitting there with his hand up Kermit, and like he's talking to the puppet, not to Jim.
It's amazing. The what I sent you guys right before we started recording, where it's like Frank Oz and Jim Henson, and they're all just sitting there. The three guys are sitting there, and Kermit is with Jim Henson, but the whole time Jim Henson is talking, like Kermit is reacting to like what everybody's saying and just doing his own thing. It is freaky. Like, it's just so weird.
It's amazing. So one of Jim's favorite type of shows to watch on TV back in those early days was the variety show, which was a staple in the early days of television. These were shows that featured an ensemble cast of comedians, singers, orchestras, musicians, all kinds of performers that were all performing live with comedy sketches and songs and all types of other performances, kind of just bouncing off each other, like going from one thing to the next. And of course, there were plenty of shows made for kids, many of them featuring puppets. There were popular shows like Howdy Doody or Life with Snarky Parker, but Jim's favorite was called Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, and it starred a talented puppeteer named Burr Tillstrom, who Jim would befriend later on in life. Jim also loved reading the funny pages, like I think probably all of us did when we were kids, right?
Oh, yeah.
And by this time, Jim was already starting to draw his own cartoons. And in fact, in 1950, the Christian Science Monitor published one of his cartoons. This was a big deal for Jim. He had submitted a bunch of cartoons to them, and they finally published one. I think he was 13 years old when they did that. So the comics section of the Washington Post served as a huge inspiration for this budding cartoonist or artist, and no comic in the funny pages was a bigger inspiration than Walt Kelly's Pogo, which was this comic about a kind-hearted possum living in the Okefenokee swamp who often found himself wrapped up in the lives and shenanigans of the colorful cast of characters who surrounded him. It's a format that Jim would later use with the Muppets, with Kermit acting as sort of the straight man, surrounded by a lot of much zanier characters.
I guess I'll step in really quick and say I too am from in and around the Okefenokee Swamp area, Waycross, Georgia, and Pogo was a big deal in my hometown. I think
was he like y'all's official mascot down there?
He's in a lot of different places. He's like his like just images of him stuck on stuff. And there's the Okefenokee Swamp Park that you would go to that just blew my wife's mind last time I took her there, because there's just gators just hanging
out.
Yeah. But there is also a special like exhibit like for Walt Kelly and Pogo. and stuff. So
Like a little museum kind of thing?
Yeah, it's like the Okefenokee Swamp Park has like just a bunch of different stuff, but yeah, there's like a little section of it that is like just Walt Kelley stuff, or like
So it's actually in the park, which is like a state park or something, right?
yeah, it's in the park. Yeah.
Wow, that's cool.
But it's kind of neat. Yeah. So I grew up knowing all about Pogo, and his strip is in the Waycross newspaper. Last I saw one, it was still in there, still running.
Wow.
Like they would have a Pogo strip in there. So
I guess they're just reusing old ones or something.
yeah, it must be.
Because Walt Kelley can't still be alive.
No, I don't think. Yeah, I think he stopped doing it a while.
Or somebody else started doing it for him, which happens a lot.
But super inspirational, by the way. I did not know this except for because of this and because of reading about Jim Henson being inspired by Walt Kelley. And you mentioned Jeff Smith. He's had to have been inspired by Pogo.
He has to be. Yeah, like the
he
artwork
was.
He was? Okay.
Yeah. And so I finally looked it up and like searched for it. Robert Crumb, Jim Henson, Jeff Smith, all credit Walt Kelley. Jeff Smith at the last, like something they did for Walt Kelley, like a charity event, like donated artwork and did something with Bold and Pogo together or something.
When I saw just the design of Pogo, I'm like, that looks like he looks so much like Bone. It's wild. Because I had heard of Pogo before we did this, but he wasn't in my newspapers growing up, so I didn't really have any experience with that character or with the comics. So I looked up a bunch of them while researching this episode, and they're very funny for one thing, but I love Walt Kelley's art style, and I can definitely see its influence on Bone and honestly on Calvin and Hobbes.
I was just thinking Calvin and Hobbes, man. Yeah, because even I mean, our folks can't see this, but we have extensive notes, and Justin put one in, and as I was looking at it, I was like, God, this totally reminds me of Calvin and Hobbes.
It does, yeah.
It's super weird. I actually just Googled it as we're talking, and you look up an image. There's apparently a Pogo Fest at the Okefenokee Swamp in Waycross, Georgia, and it says Bold meets Pogo. There's like
wow,
Bold and Pogo shaking hands.
That's cool. When is that? Let's go.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's all right. I'm pretty sure this was old, but it was like for the 30th anniversary of Bold.
Well, there was another lesson that Jim learned from reading Pogo. See, Walt Kelley was a skilled satirist who often filled his comics with snarky, subversive commentary on social and political issues. So Jim learned that, if satire was presented in a sort of cutesy, seemingly safe, fuzzy package, you could get away with a lot more. Obviously, we're going to see him do that later on, but that is a lesson that he learned directly from reading Pogo.
And that kind of makes me think of, as I go through Star Trek, especially when you get into the original series, they were doing a lot of the similar things where discussing race, and instead of black and white, it's blue and green, and somehow that just package it that way. And science fiction's always been really good about commenting on society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In a way that is sort of,
you can kind of sneak it in there.
Yeah, kind of sneak it in there, and it seems more palatable to people to discuss things that way, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Pogo was known for that, and you can have it both ways, playing to kids and adults when you do like silly characters.
Mm-hmm.
Pogo was in trouble with the government at one point because McCarthy was around and McCarthyism, and he would have commentary on this stuff and had a character that was obviously McCarthy in the comic, to where like Senator McCarthy like cinema, I don't know if it was like a cease and desist or something, but called it out so much, and then his publisher was threatening to drop everything if he didn't stop it. And so he's like, all right, well, fine, we'll put this character under a hood. So he gave him a nice white hood.
Wow.
But yeah, he would like go after like Lyndon Johnson. He would, from politics to like pollution, Pogo would like tackle different things in the comic.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So as Jim entered high school, he gained a reputation as a kind, quiet, and talented boy who had a quick wit that defied his calm demeanor. And he put a lot of time into his school's drama program while he was there. Although rarely as a performer. Mostly he was designing posters and painting sets. He was doing the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff. He also joined the school's new puppetry club, most likely because they had announced that they'd be doing a performance based on his beloved Pogo comics, although he still stuck mostly to set design rather than performing. So this wasn't exactly quite his entryway into puppetry, because he wasn't much of a performer during that time. Once he got old enough to get a job, Jim started relentlessly pursuing a career in television. Like, he just contacted every studio in the Washington area, eager to work any job that they would offer. He just wanted to get his foot in the door, but he didn't have any luck at the time. There were not unsurprisingly, not a lot of studios who were willing to give a job to some random 16-year-old kid who came calling. Although it wouldn't be long before he did managed to get his foot in the door. As high school went on, he continued to work as an artist and designer, creating cartoons for student publications. He had a little side business where he was doing silkscreen posters for plays in nearby theaters. He had already made plans by this point to go to college at the University of Maryland, hoping to study stage design. But even before he graduated high school, like, he just continued looking for ways to get into the world of television. Like, he just that's all he cared about. That's all he wanted to do. He wanted to work in TV. It was this new thing, this new technology, this new way to reach people, and he wanted to be a part of it. And the opportunity finally came to him in the spring of 1954. Jim came across an announcement from a local CBS affiliate looking for youngsters 12 to 14 years of age who can manipulate marionettes. So despite being a part of the school's puppetry club, Jim did not consider himself a puppeteer, nor did he really have any interest in becoming one. But if puppetry was what was going to get him a job in television, then he was going to be a puppeteer. He immediately gave himself a crash course on puppetry. He checked out a bunch of books from the library, even taught himself how to build a rudimentary puppet. And when he presented his puppet and his newfound puppetry skills to CBS, it was enough to convince them to give him a job. And just like that, at the age of 17, Jim Henson was working in television as a professional puppeteer.
I always admire this in people, this whole fake it till you make it thing. Like, I struggle with this ability to just be like, of course I do that. And then you just figure it out as you go. And
Yeah.
you just learn. And obviously you got to have some skills already. I mean, he's obviously a talented guy, but it just that he was willing to educate himself and get in there and do it. And sometimes a lot of it's just showing up too, because I didn't know I was going to have a way to connect this to professional wrestling. But I know that, like, those guys, you'll see like people writing letters in like, hey, I want to come work for the NWA, or I want to be a wrestler, and all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, a lot of people say that, but it's like, who shows up for it, like, who, a lot of the people that are on the show now, I know several of them that were guys that just showed up and they were there and they were just looking for something to do. Like, let me help you put up the ring. Let me carry this for you. Let me do something. And then eventually you start talking to people, and then somebody notices you, and somebody says, hey, this guy seems cool. And then, you just keep going, and eventually something clicks and something hits. So it's just kind of neat to see that work out for him.
Well, the show that Jim was on did not last very long. It lasted about 3 weeks, after which it was canceled for violating child labor laws. I think a couple of the kids were under the age of 12 or something that they were supposed to be. Anyway, so it got canceled. But Jim had made an impression on Roy Meacham, who was the host of the show, and Meacham was determined to get Jim more work and even landed him a spot on his own show. It was called Saturday, where Jim's puppets would lip sync to records.
Yeah, so that child labor law thing, a lot of people don't know this, but the original Muppets were actual children with felt costumes stitched to their flesh. It really makes the first time you see It's Not Easy Being Green, it's so much darker when you know that.
Well, this Saturday show that he was on didn't last very long either. This was kind of a recurring thing where these shows would be on and then be canceled after a few weeks or a few months. But I guess in the early days of television, they were just throwing stuff at the wall to see what would stick. So this one ended up getting canceled after a little while. But Jim soon found work on another show on another network. An executive at the local NBC affiliate had caught one of Jim's performances on Saturday and offered him a job on a new show that they were developing, one called Circle 4 Rant. This was like where they showed like cowboy movies. The host would show cowboy movies. So like on the in-between part where the host was on there, they wanted some like puppet co-host with him. So that was Jim's job for a few more months. Then it ended up getting canceled as well. But by this time, Jim was actually in college, where he was majoring in home economics. See, originally, it's weird that it sounds weird that he was majoring in home economics, but originally he had entered college looking to get a fine arts degree. He wanted to paint and draw. He wanted to be a stage designer. But for some reason, at the University of Maryland, things like art and costume design and interior design and advertising all fell under the umbrella of a home economics major. And nobody seems to know why. Even Jim Henson, when he's talking about it, he's like, I have no idea why that was a home economics thing, but that's just the way it worked at this college. And the home economics department also happened to include a course on puppetry.
We've talked about it before. I know Gary did musical theater in college, but Justin, did you You did some art in college, didn't you? Took a couple of art courses?
I was a fine arts major. Yes,
Oh,
I took
were
a few
you?
art
Okay.
courses.
I actually got the chance to take a course in comic books, when I was in school, and the way that they had to sell it to the college was as an English course, so the art majors could get an English credit.
Nice.
Yeah, it was really fun. Go to school, kids, regardless of what they label it. Get those fun credits.
Yeah, get you a comic book class. Why
Or
not?
save your money and learn how to do a puppet.
Yeah, there you go. I did a puppet thing in high school, I remember, where it was in a Spanish class, believe it or not. It was like AP Spanish, I think. And one of the projects we had to do was write a performance with puppets all in Spanish. I didn't like build the puppets or anything. I think she had them, the teacher or whoever had them. But we ended up writing this whole skit in Spanish, and I had a ball doing it. It's kind of one of those things where, like, Jim Henson's a very, like, quiet, person in real life, but he kind of comes to life when he's performing with the puppet. And I felt that way because I was pretty shy in high school. But, like, when I was doing the puppet, like, it was like I'm hiding behind a curtain. Nobody can see me. It's just this thing that comes to life and is performing. And I could definitely see the appeal in doing it because even if you're not normally someone who would want to act necessarily, it's a way of performing that just like you feel like you're imparting life on something else. Like, I don't know, it's a very interesting experience. I don't remember what the story of our skit was, but I do remember that it ended with us lip syncing to the Men in Black theme song by Will Smith for some reason, which is decidedly not in Spanish. So I don't know.
I was
going
going to say a Spanish classic. Men in Black. I love that one.
I think there was something about aliens maybe that we wrote into the skit. That's how we got so there was like an alien invasion, UFOs or something. So we somehow got into doing Men in Black. I don't know. I don't remember how it happened, but it was fun.
The other thing with this class, though, is apparently, too, according to the biography, this was lots of women were in this class. So it was like mostly girls, except for like a couple of guys.
I think Jim said there was something like 500 girls to 6 guys in the home economics, not in the puppetry class, but in the home economics department. Like, it was mostly women. So like that to a 17-year-old guy who Jim Henson was a bit of a ladies' man back in.
That was the other thing that was surprising to me. Yeah, they said the people who knew him said he was very fast. Was the quote.
Ah.
That his buddy would talk about, like, I'm trying to talk to this girl and I look like Jim's got it one in the back seat. There's just like, good God, Jim, calm down.
He's a bit of a ladies' man, Well, this puppetry program was a fairly new addition to the university's curriculum. So new, in fact, that they hadn't yet hired a teacher who was proficient in the puppetry arts. They just had, I think, one of the other teachers who had another class just had to like come take charge of it. So Jim, he's a freshman. It's actually a senior class, but he's a freshman taking it. And he's got, about a year of performing puppets on television. He's the most experienced person in the room, and that included the teacher. So it wouldn't be long before he basically just kind of took things over and took over the whole class.
So now he's basically like Leonardo DiCaprio and Catch Me If You Can. Like he's just assuming the job. Again, I just want to point out that I am blown away by these people. There was somebody recently we were talking about like this that just put themselves in the position and they just go for it. And
maybe Brad Bird or somebody like sending in, because he ended up sending all this his cartoon into Disney and getting an apprenticeship with the 9 Old Men and it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, you're just like, now I'm doing this. Now I'm the captain now.
Yeah. So, obviously the puppetry class, part of their whole thing is they would have to put on performances throughout the semester. And in one of the class's performances, it was a marionette performance, I believe. Jim was particularly impressed by the puppetry skills of a 20-year-old art and education major. She was a senior named Jane Nebel. He was so impressed, in fact, that he asked her to help him out with another project that he was about to start work on. You see, Jim had recently been asked to join the lineup of a new TV show called Afternoon. The TV shows back then were not very creatively titled.
No.
Were they? You've got Saturday, you've got Afternoon.
There was Friday.
You've got Tonight. Even like Saturday Night Live was originally just called NBC Saturday Night. It's like shows were just named after when you could watch them.
Yep. That's it.
That's just it. Anyway, so Jim got asked to be on Afternoon, this new show that was to air on the local station WRC, and he asked Jane to join him. He needed an assistant, basically. Well, Afternoon made its debut at 2:15 p.m. on March 7th, 1955. And that debut, that date, is significant for a couple of different reasons. One, it was the true beginning of Jim and Jane's professional partnership, which is going to go on for years and years. And two, there was a notice printed in the TV highlights section of the Washington Post. And this is what it read: 2:15 p.m. afternoon. A new variety program features Mac McGarry and Willard Scott as co-hosts. And yes, it is that Willard Scott, in case you were wondering, from was the Today Show, you know?
Yeah.
It is that Willard Scott. I think he was like 20 years old at the time. This is like one of his first gigs. So a new variety program features Mac McGarry and Willard Scott as co-hosts, fashion information from Inga, music by Mel Clement Quartet, vocals by Jack Maggio, and special features by the Muppets, who are puppeteers. So this was the first time that the term Muppets had ever appeared in print, even though it does erroneously refer to Jim and Jane as the Muppets, as if the performers are called the Muppets. But regardless, this is the first time the word Muppet was ever used in any sort of like official capacity, I guess. Now, Jim had been using the term Muppet for a while at this point, at least since the previous December when he was working on Circle 4 Ranch. But as for where that term comes from, it's a little bit of a mystery. For years, Jim told people that it was a cross between the words marionette and puppet, but the Muppets don't really use marionette, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. And he later admitted it was literally just a word that they made up.
I also saw like a mention of like Moppet, a small child or something.
Yeah,
goes back to that origin story I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Well, Brian J. Jones mentions that in that Jim Henson biography, but he kind of he's sort of doing his own, like, he's making an educational guess that could possibly be where Jim and her, because there was a TV show that Jim watched, or maybe it was a radio show, but it had the word Moppet in it, Moppet, which is, is a term for a small child or whatever. But it is possible that Jim used that term as inspiration, but probably he just liked the way it sounded, like Gronkle, like Muppet, like Muppet. That's a good word, and it sounds weird and different, and it sounds, like you said about the bird, it sounds like it means something. It's a made-up word that sounds like it means something, right?
Right, exactly.
And it's got that strong, like, T at the end. I don't know. It's just one of those words that just works. It just, like, you hear it, and it sounds like something that should have always existed. So Afternoon was a hit for WRC. And after a couple of months, the studio asked Jim and Jane to create a standalone 5-minute show that would air at 11:25 p.m. each night, which was a prime piece of television real estate that fell in the 5-minute time frame between the end of the local evening news and the start of The Tonight Show with Steve Allen, which was obviously a big deal. This new show was called Sam and Friends, and it starred several Muppets that Jim had been using on Afternoon, with a bald, round-nosed human character named Sam as the star. Sam and Friends allowed Jim and Jane a degree of creativity that they didn't really have on Afternoon. So they're no longer tied to this variety show format, because as on Afternoon, there were only so many things they could do. It was mostly lip syncing to records. With Sam and Friends, they were really able to create their own world and create a more immersive world for their puppet cast. Now, while Sam, and you guys have seen Sam, I mean, he doesn't look like what we expect a Muppet to look like. I think his head was made out of paper mache. It's not felt like most of the Muppets, although most of the rest of the cast is felt like we would expect Muppets. But he's an interesting design for a Muppet. Not really what we're used to seeing. He's fun to watch, though. But even though he had a fairly straightforward design, a more, I guess, traditional puppet design, many of the friends of the title skewed more towards the abstract, which is kind of going to be the norm with Jim's puppet designs going forward. You had a character named Harry the Hipster. He's kind of shaped like a snake. He wore sunglasses and he talks like a beatnik. He actually talks a lot like Dr. Teeth, if you listen to him, if you ask me. That's one thing about Jim's Muppet voices, is that if you listen to enough of them, you start to hear very similar sounding characters over the years. Like he'll find a voice that he likes and he'll use it for another character down the line. But yeah, the Harry talks a lot like Dr. Teeth. There's a character named Yorick who I don't think talks at all. I've never seen him talk in any of the sketches, but he's this prune-colored skull-like thing that doesn't seem to have a body. He's just like a head with kind of a permanent like scowl on his face. You had the beak-nosed twins, Hank and Frank. There's one called Mushmelon, who I've only seen pictures of. I haven't seen any sketches. Maybe none of the footage of him exists anymore, but he's this like really bizarre-looking Muppet with a wide, smushed head. Very strange looking. Yeah.
I was looking at this picture and I was like, I don't remember Mushmelon. I before we started, I actually did watch one skit where I think Yorick did talk, and it was like briefly, but yeah, I had not seen him. The one I kept seeing pop up is the one where he the
I've
face
grown accustomed to your face.
I've grown accustomed to your face. Yeah,
it's good. That one's really good.
Yeah, I love that.
So also among the cast was another Muppet that was particularly special to Jim, partially because it was one that he had constructed while spending time with his grandfather, who was slowly dying of heart failure. So as he was kind of sitting vigil over his grandfather, Jim would turn to creativity as a way to work through his grief. Like, he knew his grandfather was dying. He wanted a way to use that to create. You know, this is something that Jim's going to actually do over and over again throughout his life. But he ended up raiding the closet of his parents' home, and he found this old felt coat of his mother's. So he'd spend the days hunched over their dining room table, creating a new puppet, this milky blue creature that he named Kermit. So for the eyes, he literally just cut a ping pong ball in half, and he inked 2 little slash circles across them and glued those on for the eyes. And just like that, Jim had created one of his most popular and enduring Muppets. Although at the time, Kermit wasn't a frog. He wasn't even green. He was just another abstract thing like all these other Muppets.
it really adds some weight to old Kermit, though, doesn't it? To know that he made it for his dying grandfather.
Yeah, and he would like entertain his grandfather with it and stuff, I think, like as he was sitting at his bed. And Kermit also is definitely the most like Jim of any of the Muppets. Like the Kermit voice that he does is very, very close to Jim Henson's just regular speaking voice.
Yeah,
honestly.
yeah.
Like when you hear Jim Henson talk in an interview or whatever, you really hear Kermit the Frog. He just pitches it up a little bit for Kermit, but Kermit is really like, he's very close to Jim's heart, partially because of this experience, and as a result, he kind of becomes an extension of Jim Henson.
I think it was like early on they were taking polls of the show. It's weird. Like Kermit obviously becomes the star, but
Yeah.
like I think I was watching one thing that was saying like early on, in polls, like Yorick was like the most popular,
Yeah.
and like Kermit was like fourth.
Yeah, and I think he probably started to emerge as the star because he was so special to Jim, But and also as a puppet design, he's very emotive, more so than a lot of the other ones was. Because like Sam can't make facial expressions. He's just like, he can open his mouth and stuff, but he can't really do anything. Like Kermit is a very simple puppet whose head is basically the shape of your hand.
Mhm.
And so it allowed Jim to create like facial expressions just by moving his fingers certain ways, because it was basically just felt and a hand inside of it, which is not what puppets really looked like at the time. Like he was essentially inventing a whole new type of puppetry, not even really meaning to. It didn't seem like it, just something that he just did it the way that he felt they should be done, and in doing so created these creatures that were much more, they could emote much more than anything that had come before.
Yeah, when you start watching Sam, this show, then you start getting like, it's fun to see all the new things he's inventing, or just watching like Idea Man, the Jim Henson thing, or something like that. You get a handle on, or that defunct TV thing that you sent us to, that there really wasn't anything like this before, and to see what he's creating, just like this whole new way of using puppets is pretty interesting, dude.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Over the course of the show, as Gary mentioned, Kermit became kind of the breakout star. You see, in its earliest installment, Sam and Friends relied pretty heavily on the Muppets lip syncing to records, usually like old novelty records or comedy acts. But as the show went on, Jim began experimenting with character voices. He even began writing his own sketches, showcasing his own sense of humor, which usually consisted of bad puns, clever wordplay, and exploding puppets, which was kind of a recurring puppet motif. And Kermit was a big part of that because he was so emotive, like we were saying. And part of the show's success is because people had just never seen anything like this before. It sounds weird to say now because this type of puppetry has become so commonplace on television and in movies, but at this time, what Jim Henson was doing with puppets was sort of unheard of. And maybe it's because he never really studied puppetry or ever really aspired to be a puppeteer, so he wasn't trying to emulate what anyone had done before. So all of his creative decisions just came from his own imagination, not from saying, well, this is how so-and-so did it, so this is how it needs to be done. It kind of gave him not coming from a puppetry background or really knowing much about it other than what he taught himself, sort of gave him a freedom to be more creative and not be tied into what's expected from a puppeteer.
It's kind of weird because when you set out on your own creative journey, like if not being married to one discipline or another allows you to view any discipline as more tools in how to shape your own vision, as opposed to starting in a particular discipline and trying to find or adapt other things into that. When you just start out, just doing what you want to do, and everything is helping you get somewhere else. Because I mean, we know and we've seen the images that puppetry was the tip of the iceberg of Jim Henson's imagination, but puppetry helped him get there. It's a really fascinating journey. It's a really fascinating journey.
Because I feel like when you're getting into something too, like a lot of times you run the risk of like, I don't know, not disrespecting, but like certain things are done a certain way for a reason sometimes. And so then the willingness to try to buck those rules, I guess, do something different. Jim Henson definitely throughout his career's got this like motto of like, look at different angles to do things. And like sometimes the simplest way is the cleverest way, I think is one of his quotes. And just find there's more than one way to do things, and find the way that nobody's tried before or something.
And I mean, before the Muppets, puppetry on TV was little more than just filmed puppet shows. You had a performer hiding behind a puppet stage with the character poking out of a curtain. Same thing that you would see if you were seeing a puppet show in real life. It's just there was a camera pointed at it. But Jim saw potential in television and in using the television frame to show puppetry in ways that hadn't been done before. So he didn't want to show puppet shows on television. He wanted to create a television puppet show, one that was tailor-made for the medium. And on Sam and Friends, he didn't need a puppet theater. The four sides of the TV were the theater. He didn't need walls or curtains to hide the performers. They could simply kneel below the frame, of what the camera was showing. So without these limitations, Jim's puppets had the entire viewing area, the whole screen, the whole TV screen in which to exist. And Jim just seemed to inherently understand that the only thing that matters on a TV show is what the camera actually sees. Anything off frame doesn't matter. So to aid in their performance, because they were having to kind of kneel down on the ground below the camera, Jim and Jane started using television monitors, which is sort of innovative. They weren't the first ones to use it, but they were the first ones to use it this extensively. But they would basically use a television monitor that was showing what the TV audience would see so that they could see their performance in real time. They wanted to see what the camera sees because that's what the audience sees. And it's a technique that Jim would continue to use in increasingly innovative ways over the decades.
Thinking of this kind of reminded me of, I'm going to do it again, professional wrestling, how like the commentary booth, they have...
Start taking a shot every time you mention wrestling and Todd mentions Star Trek.
Yeah! But the commentators are there describing, talking about the action that you're watching when you're watching the show. And it makes no sense for them, even though they're in the room with what's going on, to look up at what's right in front of them. They watch on a monitor instead, so they see what you're seeing as the viewing audience, on TV.
Which makes
sense.
Talking
about it. So they're talking about it as like that they're seeing what you're seeing.
Because if it's not happening on that monitor, then they don't need to comment on it because the audience isn't seeing that anyway. I mean, the people in the room are, but most of the people are watching this on TV.
Right, exactly. The real thing I wanted to say here, though, too, is that this is a great place you were talking about this earlier with like Jim's hand movements with Kermit's mouth and that sort of thing. Just the skills he started to develop in here, or the angles he took with puppetry, were just so impressive to me. Just one that would fit in here would be like the rushing at the camera kind of thing that they do. And
because before, when they were using just puppet stages, I mean, they can go left, they can go right. They can't go forward and back really because there's nowhere to go.
Yeah, exactly. And so now he's making this like a bigger playground, and then you'll see him talking about stuff like just slightly having the eyes crossed. Like if you look at like one of these pictures we just had of Kermit, his eyes are a little crossed or something, but then it makes him look. He felt like it made him look a little more lifelike than just like a dead figure.
Yeah, more like he's looking right at you. It almost like skips over that whole what do you call it? The
uncanny
valley thing. Yeah.
And then also, like looking above the camera to be like thinking about something, or how he can scrunch his face up to be like aggravated, or it's just amazing. Just like all the different things that he learned to do. I don't know. It always blows my mind too that just like nobody thought of this before.
Right. Yeah. And nobody had done it before. It's always wild when something comes along where like, why had nobody thought of doing this before? But it takes somebody who's willing to say just because things have always been done this way doesn't mean that they always have to be done this way. And that's kind of like his main way of thinking about anything. Honestly, it's like why don't we do something new? So Sam and Friends was a huge hit for WRC and for Jim and Jane, who agreed to continue their partnership even after Jane graduated from the University of Maryland in 1955.
It should also be noted later that year, Doc Brown would invent time travel.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you know, just keeping every.
How much later? What month was it?
It was around October.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think sometime in October.
So, I mean, he was already working on inventing it. He just fully realized it.
Yeah.
Let's get the history right here.
Yeah. Listen, if you tune into Cinema Shock for history and details.
So as the Muppets grew in popularity, Jim started getting requests to appear on other local shows. So this thing that he had done as sort of an entryway into television, this thing that he honestly kind of decided to do as a lark. You know, it feels like he's just like, I'm just going to try this and get my foot in the door, and then I'm in television and I can work on something else. Well, this thing was turning into a real job. And Jim was actually making good money doing it. When he was 19 years old, he's a 19-year-old college kid. Most of his friends are working minimum wage jobs at, the local soda shop or wherever. Jim's making about $5,200 a year to perform on television, which is the modern day equivalent of about $61,000 a year. To do what is essentially his part-time job. But even with the recognition and the money, Jim didn't really see a future in puppetry. He still considered this just an entryway into what he thought was a quote-unquote real job in television, whether that be stage design, direction, or production. But still, regardless, he was on his way. Like, he was in the industry, so he was happy about that. And then in April of 1956, tragedy struck when his older brother Paul, who lived in Florida at this time where he was training to be a Navy pilot, was killed in a car accident. Now, for the Henson family, who was always incredibly close, this was a devastating loss. And his brother's untimely death seemed to create an urgency in Jim. So suddenly, this 19-year-old kid was hyper aware that his clock was ticking, that we all have such a short amount of time on this planet to live and to create. And Jim had so many dreams and so many ideas, and now he had to face the reality that he probably wasn't going to have time to do it all. So he would spend the rest of his life trying to accomplish as many of these things as he could. And of course, there were plenty of opportunities to do so. After Afternoon was canceled, Jim was asked to be a regular on a new show on the network called Floodlight Theater. Jim soon began to catch the attention of people outside of the D.C. area. Up in New York, the producers of Steve Allen's Tonight Show were hearing a lot about this little Sam and Friends puppet show that was their lead-in down south on the D.C. affiliate. And then on October 11th of that year, the Muppets made their first appearance on The Tonight Show, giving them their first ever exposure to a national audience.
That is a great performance, by the way. They did really, really well.
Yeah, the I've Grown Accustomed to Your Face performance.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
It's so good. So if you haven't seen it, I'll try to throw this up in our Discord or on Instagram or somewhere, wherever I can put it. But it's also on YouTube. But it's basically Kermit, who's wearing a wig, I believe, in it, right? Wearing like a blonde wig, singing this, I think it's a Rosemary Clooney song called I've Grown Accustomed to Your Face. And there's this little hooded, like it's got like, it looks like a ghost, kind of like a ghost, kind of like sheet over a face.
Yeah.
That slowly starts to eat the sheet, and then it ends up being Yorick, who tries to then eat Kermit. It's very, very funny. It's hilarious. And it goes on for like 2 or 3 minutes, really short, no dialogue. It's just lip syncing to the song. But just the performance of the two puppets is honestly, Jim and Jane's performance in that is so funny.
Yeah.
It's hilarious with no words at all.
I love Kermit's early drag. Era.
Kermit does a lot of drag early on.
Yeah.
Honestly, even in that Idea Man documentary, like Jim's like Kermit's sex was pretty interchangeable when he first started performing. Kermit could be anyone.
People don't talk about it enough that like Bugs Bunny and Kermit, they were excellent drag performers.
They were. They were great at it.
Yeah.
But also, I just I think that the thing with Jim's brother, it's interesting that it makes him focus so much on time, because I feel like that isn't everything from here on. Like it's
big time. Yeah.
Like you can tell that that's something that like weighs on his mind. Just
the passing of time, the ticking of the clock. The ticking of the clock over and over, like that's something you're just going to see pop up again and again. And it's very much like Jim knowing, like, I've got to like do as much as I can in the little time that I have. Of course, in retrospect, we know that his time on this planet was far too short. But honestly, he became an obsessive workaholic as a result of it, which is not entirely healthy and may have contributed to his untimely death. To be honest, but the reason that he accomplishes so much in a short amount of time is because he just was constantly could not stop himself. It's like he just couldn't help it. He had to be creating something all the time.
Yeah, it's amazing like what somebody puts out in that, but then you wonder that balance is always tough. But then he also did leave such a huge legacy. It's just I was noticing it even in like one of the skits for the visual thinking one or something.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
That was on Sam and Friends. Yeah.
Yeah, Sam and Friends. I mean, the clock above his head or something at one point, or when he started to learn how to visually think or something. And I was like, that's interesting. I wonder, like obviously that's above Jim's head.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know what the timeline on visual thinking was, if it came along before or after Paul passed.
Oh yeah, I was going to mention that. I don't know either, because I was going to say like it actually seems like potentially this was something that was just in his brain already, and this just the death of his brother just like enhanced it.
Yeah, accelerated that way of thinking. Yeah. Well, business was booming for the Muppet crew, which was just Jim and Jane at this point, just the two of them. In 1957, they officially agreed to be business partners. They're like, we don't know how far this Muppet thing's going to go, but we're going to be in it together. And almost immediately after making this decision, they got another life-changing opportunity when they were contacted by an advertising agency and asked to create a series of commercials for the Wilkins Coffee Company. Wilkins was like a, regional coffee company, like Community Coffee is in Louisiana. You've got, they were like the coffee company kind of around the DC area. Well, the job that they were hired for was for 15 10-second commercials with the option to create more if Wilkins was happy with the results. So Jim would have to tell a story or at least tell a joke in a short 8-second window, because the last 2 seconds they had to show the product. They had to cut to a picture of the coffee, So he had 8 seconds to tell a story, which is really short, even for a commercial. So he wanted to create the same sort of chaotic energy that he'd started bringing to Sam and Friends, which was getting more and more outlandish as it went on and ending and more puppets exploding, it seemed like, as it went on. It's just he loves exploding puppets. But what he ended up doing for these commercials was basically using these advertising spots to make fun of advertising itself. And he did so with the aid of two new characters that he named Wilkins and Won'tkins. So here was the concept. And I love these characters. I think they're great. You've got Wilkins, who will drink coffee, and Won'tkins, who won't.
Oh, that's unpredictable.
So every one of these commercials worked pretty much the same way. You had Wilkins asking Won'tkins to try Wilkins coffee. Won'tkins refuses, leading Wilkins to, let's say, punish Won'tkins in a variety of creative ways. And it was the increasingly absurd forms of punishment that Wilkins doled out that made the commercial such a hit. I mean, over the course of these ads, Won'tkins would find himself clubbed, blown up, shot, squished, even decapitated for refusing Wilkins coffee.
Genius in simplicity.
It's so good. And the characters are both also like, they're kind of classic Jim Henson creations. Visually, they've got that same contrasting Laurel and Hardy design that would become a Henson staple. Like if you think of like Bert and Ernie or Bunsen, Honeydew, and Beaker, these like, you got a tall, skinny one, a short, chubby one, or whatever. Like it's a thing that he does a lot. It was even something he was doing with his cartoons back in high school, this idea of these two contrasting characters. But they're also an example of him using comedy and endearing characters to get away with being a little bit dangerous, which was a lesson that he had learned from Pogo.
Well, you don't have to worry about it so much because everybody knows Muppets can't die. They don't have souls. So they
I don't know about that, Gary.
They're immortal.
But they're still real to me, damn it.
Yeah, let's talk about the violence
Nice.
for just a second, because the first few of these that I saw where somebody got like shot with a cannon, or they got
The very
blown
first
up,
one, the very first one, he gets shot with a cannon. I think that's the first one ever where he says,
but
like,
all of those, I'm like, okay, a little over the top. It's silly. But for some reason, the one where like a revolver comes out on the side of the screen and shoots him in the head, I'm like, good God.
Yeah.
Yeah. They would not get away with some of those commercials today. I watched a bunch of these Wilkins commercials. Like I bet I watched 3 dozen of them. Like I just put on like a YouTube playlist that just had them playing over and over. They're very funny.
Yeah.
Like they're really funny, but there are a lot of them that like they would definitely not get away with them today. And the revolver one is definitely one of those where I can't remember what the pun is, but yeah, literally a human hand comes in off the side of the screen and shoots Wonkins in the head. Shoots him. Like one of them, they're in an airplane and he says like, "Oh, did you bring your parachute? No, I forgot it. Did you bring the Wilkins coffee? No, I forgot that too." So he spins the airplane upside down so he falls out to his death. Like it's stuff like that. It's very funny though. It's kind of like, how many ways can you kill a Muppet?
It's Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, but
yeah.
because it's these Muppets, it hits so much harder. I feel like
they're so funny. They're hilarious. If you want to check out some of Jim Henson's very early comedy work, I mean, check out the Salmon Friends stuff too, obviously. But the Wilkins coffee commercials you can understand why they were popular. They're really funny. They were an enormous success for both Jim and for the coffee company. They sent the sales of Wilkins coffee soaring. I think they had like a 25% increase in sales after these commercials started airing.
Wow.
Jim and Jane won local awards for excellence in advertising. So Wilkins, of course, wanted more commercials. And over the years, Jim and Jane would end up producing almost 180 commercials for the coffee brand.
Jeez.
And the success of these ads caught the attention of other companies who started recruiting Jim to sell their own products. Now, a lot of these were other regional coffee companies, which allowed Jim to just reuse gags. Although, Jim was a perfectionist, so he refused to just like dub the new brand's name over the word Wilkins, and he would actually reshoot the entire commercial for each coffee brand because he wanted the Muppets, he wanted the mouths to match up.
Yeah.
So despite his steady work, the good money, all that stuff, Jim was still kind of unsure if puppeteering was in his future. He still saw himself working in television as a set designer, maybe a fine art painter, because he was an artist. In fact, Jim nearly quit doing Salmon Friends altogether. But when this was brought up to the brass at WRC, they begged Jim to stay on board. They're like, "You cannot leave. This is like the biggest hit we have on this station. You can't leave." This little 5-minute Salmon Friends show. They even said that they would continue to pay him if he wanted to bring somebody else on board for the day-to-day operations. So they would keep paying Jim as a producer, I guess, and that Jim was allowed to hire somebody else on to like actually perform. And that's exactly what Jim ended up doing. He recruited an old friend of his from high school named Bobby Payne. He gave his friend a crash course on Muppet performing, essentially letting Bobby take over his performing duties on the show alongside Jane. And in the meantime, Jim decided he's going to pop over to Europe for a bit. A little bit of a sabbatical. He intended to just travel around the continent for a few weeks studying painting. He's just going to study art for a while. And for the first few weeks, that's exactly what he did. But along the way, he discovered something really interesting. He discovered that in Europe, puppet shows were not only very popular, but they were taken seriously as a form of entertainment. He was fascinated by the culture surrounding puppetry in Europe. And this was also the first time that Jim was able to experience puppet shows as an audience member. And he was amazed by how much an audience could get caught up in a good show. So soon, he abandoned, I guess, looking at paintings and sculptures in Europe. And he just started seeking out puppet shows. He started talking to puppeteers and puppet makers. And he was kind of amazed by the care that they had for their craft. These big, elaborate puppet theaters that he would see built, these big, beautiful things that have been built for what is seen as children's entertainment in the U.S. During this trip to Europe, this is when Jim really started viewing puppetry as a true, valid art form.
There was a video I watched of Jim on Orson Welles.
Yeah. And, there are some clips of that in Idea Man. It's pretty great.
Yeah, those are
Oh
fun.
yeah, maybe that's what I'm even thinking of, because I just remember seeing it that Orson Welles was like blown away that Jim was like, "You're telling me that you wanted to get into TV so bad that you didn't care about puppetry. You just did that as the method to get in." I don't know. It seemed like it was surprising to Orson Welles that like it wasn't already a passion of his, but that's something to consider there. But then he goes to Europe and starts to get this actual appreciation for the art of puppetry. And I just read Grady Hendrix's book, How to Sell a Haunted House, and not to give too much away about that book, but
there is a puppet.
But there is a puppet. There's a section in it though where one of the people is telling a story about joining like a traveling puppet troupe, and how they taught him about the history of puppetry, and that like puppetry is supposed to be dangerous, and like it's supposed to be exciting, and that over in Europe, like with the Punch and Judy shows and like all this other stuff, that they're like it's a serious art form and all of that. So it's kind of interesting to just come off that. And then
that's funny. Yeah,
you're reading about Jim like going to Europe and
and he
that.
specifically mentioned the Punch and Judy shows that he saw over there as one of the things that inspired him, like seeing the comedy in those. And you can see, I mean, obviously Punch and Judy shows are somewhat violent, know, so that's an inspiration on Jim. We already know he loves his violence from the Wilkins coffee commercials and from Sam and Friends sometimes too. So he can use violence in a very funny way, so he saw that being done in Europe as well. That probably helped maybe validate,
like, okay, I'm on the right track.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this whole trip to Europe was a real turning point for Henson. He came back from Europe invigorated, bursting with ideas. He no longer saw the Muppets as a stopgap on the way to a real career in television. He saw that in the right hands, puppetry could be as valid as any other art form.
In the right hands. I see what you did there, Justin Bishop.
Little wordplay. So with this new creative energy, Henson started jotting down sketches, notes on concepts for new shows. Like he couldn't get his ideas onto paper fast enough. And one of the concepts that got the furthest along was an adaptation of the Hansel and Gretel fairy tale. He worked with his friend Bobby Payne to create several puppets and build several sets for the production before eventually abandoning it for being, in Jim's words, ridiculously overcomplicated. He's like, this is too much. This is too much. But just the process of working on Hansel and Gretel was a major stepping stone for Henson as an artist, because he was doing more than just telling quick jokes, which is mostly what he'd been doing so far. He was becoming a storyteller.
It's kind of like it's kind of like when you start writing a story or script the first time, and anybody who is offering advice on writing is always going to tell you, like, look, your first draft is going to be garbage, but get it out, and then take what you learn to the next one. And it seems like that was the case here with Hansel and Gretel. It was like, yeah, it never got off the ground, but I bet he learned a hell of a lot.
He learned a lot from it. Yeah. He learned a lot from the experience that he brought to other things. So he started seeing big things in the future for the Muppets. But in the meantime, he was still having to make all these appearances that, paid the bills, doing talk shows and variety shows and commercials and all that. After he returned from Europe, he went back to college and he finished his degree. He didn't really need to at this point because he kind of had his career planned out, but he felt education was important. So he wanted to go back to school and finish his degree. So, with his like sabbatical and all that stuff and taking breaks from college, I think it took him about 6 years to get his degree, but he finally got it. His degree was in home economics, technically. And he continued appearing on Sam and Friends, as well as a couple other, daily spots on WRC. I think by this point he was on like WRC 3 times a day. The Sam and Friends thing was still at night, but he had a couple other ones throughout the day. This is all filmed live, by the way. So he's like having to show up at the studio multiple times a day. He continued making appearances on The Tonight Show, where he was very popular, kept making Wilkins commercials and all kinds of other commercials.
He also could make a hell of a butt cake.
Is that true?
No, I don't.
It could be. I don't know.
From his home ec stuff, I don't know.
Would you be surprised, honestly?
I would not at all. Actually, I would not. I would think that was a valid statement.
Here's the thing. We'd all be disappointed if it was just a delicious bundt cake. But it would be totally on par if the cake asked how it tasted.
Or, well, he has the oven mitts would have to have
how's it tasting?
That's your cake Muppet voice?
Yeah, that's my cake Muppet voice.
So with all of this work they were doing, Jim and Jane decided it was probably time to make things official, moving beyond a mere business partnership and founding their own company, which they called Muppets Incorporated. And they made it official in another way too. You see, when they'd first started working together, Jim and Jane's relationship remained strictly professional. In fact, they were both engaged to other people this whole time. Not this whole time, but for a lot of this time, they were engaged to other people. But over the years of working together so closely, things started to change, and there was this natural chemistry between the two of them. Like they just worked so well together. They were able to bounce off each other while they were performing. They could almost like, it sounds cliche, but they're the type who could finish each other's sentences. You know, like they just knew what the other one was thinking. Like there was almost a telepathic link between them, you know. And this natural chemistry was a major part of why they worked so well together. But it eventually led to a romantic relationship as well. So over time, they broke off their engagements to their fiancés and they started dating a little bit. It was never like Jim never like asked her out on a date. It was just a thing that kind of happened. It seemed like Jane even says in interviews that like, you know, there was never really a falling in love. It was just all of a sudden we were together kind of thing. You know, so after he returned from Europe, Jim decided, hey, maybe we should also get married. So he proposed to Jane. And she accepted. And on May 28th, 1959, the two of them were wed.
It feels so awful that I had like so many things go through my brain about, you know, Jane, if you see how I stick my hand in that puppet, you know, and then like
family friendly.
But we're talking about Jim Henson. And I can't
do it.
I can't do it.
Family friendly.
Hi ho.
That's the noise she made.
Oh no. I legitimately do wonder if the Muppets were ever involved.
I would like to think they were not. Honestly, I would love to think that was that never crossed their mind.
You remember like seeing like reading about like Vince McMahon, you know, like he had like toys named after like the Undertaker. And
is that true?
I thought I read that. I think that the letter that they had said that. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing: Vince McMahon did a considerable amount of cocaine compared to Jim Henson, I would say.
Yeah, probably so.
I like to think the sound the yip yips make is Jim climaxing.
Yep. Uh-huh.
Jim's probably less of a piece of shit, I imagine, too.
Than Vince McMahon. Not very few people are more of a piece of shit than Vince McMahon. So, anyway, family friendly. For the next year or so, was pretty eventful for the newlywed Hensons. They purchased a house in Bethesda, Maryland, which housed Jim's first real Muppet workshop in the basement, as well as a new toy for him to tinker with. A 16 millimeter Bolex camera, which he used to create what he called animated paintings, which is really kind of his first foray into filmmaking.
Who does this remind you of?
David Lynch.
Yeah, correct.
It does. And there's so much about this story that makes me think of David Lynch.
Like, it was happening to me too. Yeah.
Yeah. As I like, they're both obsessed with ideas. You know, they both sort of fell into filmmaking. Obviously, Jim Henson always wanted to be in television, you know, but he took a really strange route to get to where he got, you know, whereas David Lynch always saw himself as an artist first and foremost. And the first thing one of the first things that got him noticed was this idea of creating moving paintings. And that was the stuff that we talked about in that first episode of our David Lynch series. So I could not, like, watching this whole thing, I could not think of anything but how similar they are and how different their approach to art is, but how similar their like journeys to get there are. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating because how many people would compare David Lynch to Jim Henson? But
you would not, except that they both also seem to have a similar personality. Wise, like
kind of G. Williker,
yeah,
Jimmy Stewart-esque, you know.
And when you see Jim Henson like experiment with filmmaking, I every one of them that I watched, I was like, of course, this is what this is.
Yeah,
like
it's very weird, very experimental. Like one of the first ones that Jim did was called Drums West. Did you watch that one? It's basically an animation, like because this Bolex camera that he had this setting on it where you could shoot frame by frame, which is perfect for stop motion animation. So he had a an animation table, and he would film it one frame at a time. And there's footage of him doing this that I guess Jane must have shot. But the final thing, look up Drums West. Jim Henson Drums West. It's about, I don't know, it's 2 or 3 minutes long tops. It might be a minute and a half long, but it's basically animated cutouts set to this kind of jazz soundtrack. Jim loved jazz, so a lot of these are set to jazz. But it's really good, and it shows you like his proclivity to very rhythmic editing, because it's very much like set to the exact beat of the music. Like, it's really fascinating, and he does that a lot. Like, he would write out ideas for these little short films he was doing specifically with the music in mind, and he would write down like the time of, like, this is the time of the song, like this is the exact millisecond when this cut's going to happen when we edit it. Like, he was very precise about it being exactly the exact rhythm that he wanted it to be. And Drums West, this like very early kind of short experimental film that he did, is a perfect example of that. I think it's also really fun to watch.
Yeah, and I can imagine doing something with a more traditional tune or a song being so much easier, but with jazz, like it's it blew me away. It's actually really cool.
Well, I was just sitting here thinking that of course he loves jazz, because like jazz is exactly like going back to his thought process of like finding all the different ways to get somewhere. And like in jazz, like whereas in like a traditional song, well, a good example of this would be the visual thinking skit that they did, where they're thinking of the notes, and like in a traditional song you just go like boom 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 boom, I'm here. But in jazz it's all about like losing it for a second and not being afraid to like go all over the place for a minute to get back to that note that you're trying to get to, and experimenting. And so yeah, he would love jazz for just that reason.
And that visual thinking one, we didn't really talk about that much. What they're doing is, it's Kermit and Harry, who is the kind of like hipster character, talking about visual thinking. And Kermit will say, a letter, and it'll pop up above his head, kind of thing. It's very clever. And when he starts like scatting, essentially, is what Harry's doing during that, it turns from musical notes that are visualized on the screen to just like a scribble, because it just kind of goes everywhere, like you were saying. But what's really interesting about that skit, more than almost anything else that I've seen from Sam and Friends, is that it's Jim Henson doing something that could only be done on television. Like, it could not be done live in front of an audience, because he's using the medium of television to show that visualization. It's an animation over a filmed puppet show. And the wild thing about that is that the puppets were filmed live. So he had to animate that ahead of time, and they had to have their timing down perfect so that the puppets would look at the pre-drawn animation that was going to be projected on the screen.
Yeah.
Like, it's amazing. It's so good. I think I've watched that one like 3 or 4 times over the last few days, because it's so entertaining to me knowing that that's how they had to do that. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but I didn't mention that the Hensons bought this house after they got married. This is the first time that Jim's not lived at home with his parents through all of this. This whole time he's lived at home with his parents. Like, he has never moved out of the house. He's in his early 20s, I think, at this point. So it's not like that's weird, but
Something else happened to Jim over in Europe. He learned about puppetry, but he also, I think he got laid or something.
He got laid a lot, I think, according to a couple of his friends. I think it was a bit, yeah. I think that was part of the sabbatical.
He came back ready to be a man.
Yeah,
He'd like grow the beard. Like, he'd always, I don't think we ever mentioned it, but like, one of the common stories you hear about him is he had acne and stuff. So he was always like self-conscious about that. But he
had acne, and also like his mother, being a Christian Scientist, didn't really believe in going to the doctor, so she would not let Jim get like medication for it. So he ended up getting pox scars, so he ended up hiding it behind a beard.
Right.
After returning from Europe. And he kept his beard really for the rest of his life. I think he had it at the wedding, or he got rid of it for the wedding, because I think his mother requested that he not be bearded for the wedding, and he obliged. But then after that, he immediately grew it back. But yeah, he like we said, he was a bit of a ladies' man. But during that first year, he also fathered his first child with Jane. First of many, actually. This is going to be another recurring motif here, is that the Hensons pump out children like it's nothing.
Like their Wilkins coffee commercials.
Right. Yeah, that first year, saw Jane Henson give birth to the couple's first child. This was Lisa. 2 months after Lisa was born, Jim and Jane piled into their car, which was a Rolls Royce, actually, because Jim was a bit of a gearhead. He bought some pretty fancy cars along the way. So this was kind of one of the first ones that he bought with Muppet money, was this old Rolls Royce. Not probably the best car to travel with a 2-month-old child in.
No.
1,000 miles across the country, because that's what they did. They drove across the country to Colorado, I think it was, to the 1960 Puppeteers of America convention. This convention gave Jim the opportunity to socialize with fellow puppeteers, and one of the puppeteers that he befriended there was Burr Tilson, who he had watched on television as a child. He also had a chance to meet Tilson's puppet builder, a guy named Don Salen. So that summer, the Muppets made their first appearance on the Today Show. They've been on the Tonight Show. They've been on Afternoon. They've been on Saturday. Now they're on Today. So this is yet another daytime variety show. And I don't know if this is the same like Today Show that it is now, although I imagine this is probably an early iteration of it. Like the Today Show that's on NBC. This is probably like an early version of that. But by this time, Jim had performed on enough variety shows that he was fairly certain he could write and produce one himself. And he was equally certain that the Muppets were at a point where they could carry their own full-length TV show, not these little 5-minute bits here and there. So with these ideas in mind, he started jotting down ideas for a Muppet-led variety show, eventually landing on something that he called Zookus, which is a combination of the words zoo and circus, Zookus. The show never really got past the early planning stages, him jotting down ideas, but several of the ideas and characters that he created for it would show up in the Muppet Show 15 years later.
Zookus was like another first draft.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
So when Jane became pregnant with their second child in 1961, she and Jim decided that it was time for her to retire from performing, although for now she would remain an active part of the Muppets behind the scenes. That summer, the Hensons, which included at this point a very pregnant Jane and a 1-year-old Lisa, traveled to the next Puppeteers of American convention. This time it was in California. And at this convention, Jim struck up a friendship with 2 talented puppeteers that he'd met briefly in Detroit the year before. It was Detroit, not I think I was thinking Denver, but it was Detroit the year before. So he had met these other 2 talented performers there the year before, and their names were Mike and Francis Osnowitz. Mike and Francis had 2 sons, and their youngest son, Frank, was born in 1944 and had followed in his parents' footsteps into the world of puppetry. Now, Frank Osnowitz, who would later shorten his last name to simply Oz, had grown up in the Bay Area, and he'd been puppeteering for about 4 years at this point. So since he was 11 or 12 years old, he'd been puppeteering. In Oakland, Oz had joined a puppet team where he became friends with a young man who was a few years older than him named Jerry Jewell, another talented puppet performer. The 16-year-old Oz was attending the Puppeteers of America convention, not only because his parents were there, but because he was performing in a show that Jewell had written. And Jim Henson happened to watch this show. And he was amazed at Oz's talent and at how effortlessly he performed his characters, especially at such a young age. Afterwards, Jim spoke to Oz's parents to discuss the idea of having their son come back east to join him at the Muppets. But Oz's parents felt like their son, who was, still in high school, I think he was a rising senior this summer, was a little too young to pack up everything and move to the other side of the country. Probably a good idea on their part, honestly, as parents. Frank, however, Frank recommended to Jim that he speak to his friend Jerry Jewell, which Jim did, and Jewell and Henson immediately hit it off. They had a very similar sense of humor, full of sharp wit, very playful, both of them. And as part of his pitch to Jewell, Henson gave him an impromptu performance, a Muppet performance, in the parking lot of the convention. So he went out to his car. He had a box of Muppets in the car. I mean, he probably traveled everywhere with those things, I would imagine. Yeah. So he performs for him. And Jim's performance left Jewell speechless. Like, Jewell had never seen anything like this. He'd never seen puppets that functioned like this. He'd never seen anyone perform puppets like this. He would later say of that meeting, this is a quote from Jerry Jewell. He says, "This guy was like a sailor who had studied the compass and found that there was a 5th direction in which he could sail. When he offered me a berth on that ship, I signed on."
Wow.
We'll talk a lot about Jerry Jewell over the course of this series, so don't worry. Jerry Jewell is an interesting guy and an incredibly talented performer and writer.
Seems like a nice dude, too. He says, if there had been no Frank Oz, or if Frank Oz hadn't turned down that offer, I would never been anybody, but
Yeah. Well, Jane gave birth to the Henson's second child, Cheryl, that August, and the newly hired Jerry Jewell took over Jane's performing duties on Sam and Friends. Jim, however, seemed to be getting a little bit kind of bored with the show. He felt like the Muppets had the potential to do a lot more than what the format allowed, so he was really ready to try something new. Oddly enough, the opportunity to do so came from an unlikely source, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who invited Henson and Sam and Friends to serve as the entertainment at a U.S. food fair that they were hosting in Hamburg, Germany. So basically, this food fair was to go like, "Hey, buy American food," and that was the point of it. They wanted entertainment there, so they wanted Jim Henson to do it. And Jim agreed to do the show, but he didn't want to do the same old Sam and Friends routines. Instead, he and Jewel used the show as kind of like a lab where they could experiment on new, innovative styles of puppetry. Now, one of the skits that they did was one called Chef Salad, and it featured a puppet called Omar, who, in sort of a precursor to the Swedish chef, he speaks in gibberish, and he makes a huge mess. He's like making a salad, and he's got a knife, and he's chopping everything. Very, very silly, very Swedish chef. But what made this performance so significant is that it was the first time that Jim had performed with what he called a live hand puppet. So a live hand puppet is one where the puppeteer is performing the character's mouth with one hand, and he puts his other hand into the gloved hand of the puppet so he can actually use his hand and pick up things and more than what a normal puppet could do. So usually these types of puppets have to be operated by two puppeteers, one doing the mouth and usually the left hand, while the other one does the right hand. So it's very awkward. They obviously have to work very well together to be able to do that. And it's the type of puppet that Jim's going to use a lot over the years, but this is really the first time. And nobody else had really ever done this before. This was a new, very innovative type of puppet. And one of the more experimental puppets that was created for the show, and this one just blows my mind, honestly, is this one called Limbo the Floating Face.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, man, it's so cool. So
This is so cool.
It's so cool. And it's little more than a simple face. It's basically just the shape of eyes and a mouth made out of foam rubber, which would be controlled using invisible strands of fishing line. So that's all it is. There's no head. It's just a floating mouth and two floating eyes above it.
Yeah.
If you've watched old episodes of Sesame Street, you've probably seen Limbo on there a couple of times. But when he first started using it, was there in Germany. And Jim was really excited to try out all these new forms of puppetry in front of American audiences. But first, he had to put Sam and Friends to bed, which he did in December of 1961, ending the show in a very Muppety way, which was having the whole set of the show, explode and fall to pieces around the cast. How else could you end a Muppet show, right?
Of course.
So Jim and Jerry, over time, they started doing a few more shows in Europe. They were kind of tweaking and polishing the acts that they'd performed in Germany. They even began working with mechanical puppets that would serve as precursors to the type of animatronics that the Henson Creature Shop would become known for years later. Like they created these like toy soldiers who had guns that smoke would come out of and things like that. And like doing some really like cool stuff.
Wow.
Then in June of 1962, the Muppet team, which at this point, it's I think Jim, Jane, Jerry Jewell, and Bobby Payne is still there. They all traveled down to Atlanta, Georgia to film a 30-minute pilot that Jim and Jerry had written called Tales of Tinker-D. Now, unlike his Hansel and Gretel concept, this wasn't an adaptation of a fairy tale, but it was like kind of an original fairy tale type story filled with rapid one-liners and inventive puppetry, including the first time that Jim would use a live hand puppet in America. The narrator of Tinker-D was Kermit, the breakout star of Sam and Friends. Jim loved Kermit. So in the show, Kermit played a minstrel. So he had like a lute, that he would play. And he had this little minstrel collar around his neck, which gave him the distinct look of a frog. So from then on, that's what he was. He was Kermit the Frog. I don't know at what point Kermit's color changed, to be honest, because Tales of Tinker-D is in black and white. So so it's hard to say. Yeah. I don't know when Kermit changed to green. I honestly don't. I know some of the later Sam and Friends were in color. Some of the very last ones were in color. So Kermit, I think, was already green by the time Tinker-D started, because I think Kermit appears in some of those color Sam and Friends, and he is green.
I think you're right. I feel like I remember actually seeing a picture from Tales of the Tinker-D that Kermit was green in. I feel like I read too that it was shot in color. Just the only thing we have left is
the black and white. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, because what the uploads on YouTube are all in kind of really grainy black and white. It's not a great copy, but you can watch it. It is out there. Well, the Tinker pilot was never picked up, mostly because network executives seem to have a hard time accepting puppetry on TV as anything but children's entertainment. And Jim really had no interest in doing children's entertainment. That's not what he wanted to do. He didn't want puppetry being something that could only be enjoyed by children. He wanted to prove that the Muppets could attract a grown-up audience. Well, a year later, Jim got the opportunity to prove that. He kept working steadily, appearing as a regular guest on several TV shows. He kept popping up on the Today Show. Then in 1962, he was commissioned to create a series of commercials for Purina Dog Chow. Purina's main request was that the stars of the commercial be 2 dog puppets. They wanted it to be kind of like Wilkins and Wontkins, but more suited to their brand with a couple of dogs, right? Well, one of the dogs that Jim created was named Baskerville. It's this little skinny, long-nosed pup. The other one was named Ralph. And Jim had no idea at the time, but Ralph would soon become the world's most popular Muppet. So Ralph was designed by Jim, but he was actually the first Muppet that Jim didn't build himself. Instead, he passed those duties along to Don Salen, who was, we mentioned him before, he was Burr Tillstrom's puppet builder. Jim loved this guy's work. He hired him on to build his own Muppets, and Jim loved his work on Ralph. And there was kind of a symbiosis, the way they describe it, through them. Like Don just knew exactly how to translate Jim's drawings and Jim's ideas into 3 dimensions. Like he just nailed it every time. And he was so impressed that he hired Salen to work as the Muppets chief designer and builder. And I think Don Salen did that until he passed away. Like he was the main Muppet builder and designer for decades after this. And it was around this time that the Hensons and the Muppets and the company moved to New York, where they'd set up their new base of operations. A few months after the move, Jim hired another performer to join the Muppet team, which was 19-year-old Frank Oz, now a recent high school graduate. The company they continued to create at a breakneck pace, with the Muppets continuing to appear regularly on the Today Show and some other variety shows, in addition to filming more and more commercials. I mean, if you start looking up Jim Henson commercials from this era, there are literally hundreds of them out there that and these are just the ones that are still around. There are still copies of that we can watch. And they're all pretty damn good. In 1963, the Muppets got the chance to appear on their biggest stage yet as guests on the Jimmy Dean Show, a new variety show hosted by the country music singer who'd become a crossover star with his hit Big Bad John. You know that one, right, Gary? I know you know that one.
That's a good one.
It's a good song. The man also makes a mean sausage.
Makes a hell of a sausage. Yeah,
he sure does. I got some I bought some yesterday.
I ate some this morning.
I got some Jimmy Dean sausage in the fridge. Jim, I met Jimmy Dean once.
What?
Did you really?
Yeah,
What a random celebrity encounter.
Well, I don't know if you know this. Well, you guys know. I don't know if I've ever talked about this on the podcast, but my dad for years worked for a guy named Jimmy Swaggart. So Jimmy Swaggart, if you know who that is, he was is a televangelist. Had some scandals back in the day, but anyway, Jimmy Dean's his cousin. So as is Jerry Lee Lewis. I have not met Jerry Lee Lewis. I've been in the building with Jerry Lee Lewis, but I haven't met him. But they would come visit cousin Jimmy sometimes, And so there were 2 Jimmys and a Jerry, and they were all cousins.
Wow.
Yeah, how about that? I was like 8 years old or something. I didn't care. I didn't know who Jimmy Dean was. But now I think it's
that family's got nothing better to do than name their kids Jimmy
and Jerry. Well, they got a Jerry in there.
Successful though. So
yeah, it's true. It's working. It's working for them. Anyway,
old enough to afford some hookers.
yeah, a couple times. Well, Jim Henson and the Muppet crew were asked to appear on the first 7 episodes of the Jimmy Dean Show. So Jim, Jerry, and Frank, they performed several skits on the show. But what really made an impact with audiences was the character of Ralph the dog. Ralph had been kind of retired to the Muppet Workshop cupboards after those Purina dog commercials had been made. But Jim Henson, he decided to dust him off for the Jimmy Dean Show, put him in a few skits. The first few were fairly warmly received, but the character really took off when he appeared in a skit with Jimmy Dean himself. And in that skit, the two of them performed a song called Nobody that Dean had recorded a year earlier. And there was sort of an immediate chemistry between Ralph and Dean, and audiences ate it up. Like, they loved it. And the network was bombarded with fan mail for Ralph, the dog, the puppet, which led to him becoming a mainstay on the show for the next 3 years. Like, he was on every episode, basically, of the Jimmy Dean Show.
Wow.
He was essentially the co-host of the show with Jimmy Dean, for all intents and purposes. And did you guys have a chance to watch any of the clips of this show?
I did.
So
Yep.
it's what's really incredible about watching it is how much Jimmy Dean believes in Ralph the dog. This is kind of going to what you were saying earlier about like Kermit appearing on talk shows and stuff. I think that's a major testament to Jim as a performer, because he was able to bring such life to these characters that even when humans appeared with them on screen, knowing full well that they were talking to Jim's hand. I mean, and a lot of times on like the Muppet Show, they could see Jim because he was just off camera, but he wasn't behind anything, so he was just like down on the ground next to him. But they believed that the Muppets were real. Like, not obviously intellectually they didn't believe that, but they, for all intents and purposes, like they were interacting with them as if they were a living, breathing thing there in front of them.
Yeah.
And when you watch Jimmy Dean interacting with Ralph, it really feels like he's interacting with another living creature, because it's like it's Jim's ability and the other Muppeteers, Frank Oz and those guys, it's their ability to breathe life into these felt creations that's a big part of why they became so successful. And the Muppets interacting with human co-stars, of course, is one of the main selling points on the Muppet Show years later. But there are moments in the Jimmy Dean Show where like Jimmy Dean cracks up over something Ralph says. Like, it's like he says something in that, like a joke that maybe he wasn't expecting, or just the delivery in a way that he wasn't expecting. And he almost he kind of breaks character a little bit, and he'll start laughing and hiding his face. And it's because Ralph, the way that he treats him is like he's just another cast member on the show. And I think that's why audiences loved it so much, is because it didn't feel like a man and a puppet. It felt like two members of a cast, two performers on screen, and it essentially was. And I don't know, I had never seen this Jimmy Dean stuff before, and watching it, I was like, wow, this is like pretty incredible how the way they interact together, like the way that Jimmy Dean interacts with this furry, weird looking dog creature, and the jokes are funny. There are a few that are there are some that are a little dated. There's one where I found one where they're talking about the idea of a female president that, let's say, has not aged well. But there are a lot of really funny ones. The one where Ralph has the flu cracked me up. It's a great bit. It's really funny. And you can see Jimmy Dean he crack up in that one when Ralph says something about like there's a hole in your spotlight or something like that. Like Jimmy Dean loses it. Like it's good stuff. But eventually Ralph became so popular on the show that he was receiving more fan mail than Jimmy Dean himself. He was getting more fan mail than the human on the show. And Jim Henson loved working with Dean, who by all accounts was a pleasure to be around. Like everyone who worked with Jimmy Dean seemed to really, really like him. And he also paid his people well, so the Muppets were making good money doing the show. But more important for Jim was that the enormous success of Ralph on the Jimmy Dean Show proved that there was an adult audience for puppets on TV, because this show wasn't catered to kids. This is a TV show it came on at night, and it was aimed at adults. And those adults loved the Muppets. Unfortunately, the networks didn't really share Jim's enthusiasm. And when he tried to kind of waylay Ralph's popularity into a show where Ralph will be the main star, I think the idea was that Ralph was going to go in a spaceship and go up to space and explore. That was his initial idea. The network still saw a puppet show as just kids programming, which again is not at all what Jim had in mind. He wanted this to be an adult show that starred puppets. Muppet Incorporated's main income through all of this, they were making money off the Jimmy Dean Show, but their main source of income was still making commercials. And for a while, Jim continued writing most of the commercials himself, but as time went on, and as Jim, kind of became more busy with other products, he started passing script writing duties on to Jerry Jewell. And as it would turn out, as talented as Jewel was as a puppeteer, his true talent lied in writing. Jewel, he was a natural. It just seemed like through all this that Jewel had found his true calling, and that was as a writer. So we're in about 1963 at this point. Jane Henson gives birth to yet another child. This is Brian. So this is like 3 years in a row, right? Like she's pregnant constantly for like five years or something.
Yeah.
This is their third child, Brian. First son, third child, Brian Henson. And as his family continued to grow, so did Jim's ambitions. You know, as we discussed, he had gotten into puppetry as a way to get into television. And he did it. He made it. He's in television full time. This is his job, and he's doing very well at it. But by this point, he had begun to see the potential in something bigger. At this point, television was no longer the end game. And Jim Henson wanted to make a movie. And that, friends, is where we're going to pick up on our next episode. We are going to talk about Jim Henson's first foray into filmmaking, experimental filmmaking at that. So I would say, I guess we could tell people what movies to watch, because there were, for this one, there wasn't, a lot of times we'll announce the next movie we're talking about, and, you can go watch the Muppet movie or whatever, but we're not there yet. If you want to really get the full Jim Henson experience, watch some of these short films that are out there. Watch some of the commercials that we've referenced here. We're going to throw them up in our Discord and things like that, links to them so you can watch along with us if you want. But if you want to get ahead of time, I would say the ones to really watch are Timepiece, which is his experimental short film from the early 60s. It is not on YouTube or anywhere, but it is on the Internet Archive. I'll tell you that. It's out there, and it's a pretty good quality version of it too. There's also one called The Cube that we're going to talk about that's a little bit longer. Timepiece is only like 8 minutes. The Cube's almost an hour.
Yeah,
like
it's 50 some minutes. It's a better part of an hour.
It's close to an hour, so it's out there.
I watched that this morning. I was excited to talk about it. But yeah, The Cube, it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we'll talk about that more on our next episode. Those are, I guess, the main things to talk about, although you could look up, the Jim Henson IBM spots. We're going to talk about how he got into that. There's all kinds of other stuff, but the main things I would say is to watch Cube and Timepiece, and Timepiece is, honestly, it's fantastic. It's really good.
Great.
It's really, really good. We'll talk about all that next time, as well as get into some other stuff that Jim Henson started working on in the 60s and 70s, some things you may be familiar with. So we'll get into all of that as we work our way through the life and career of Jim Henson.
And if you want the full Jim Henson experience for real, be Jane Henson, because she was getting it like every year at least.
At least every 9 months or so.
Yeah.
Every 9 months. Yeah.
for several years. Oh, man. So I think that's it for this episode, guys. I really appreciate everyone who's listening to this, because this is going to be a little bit of a different series than what we normally do. But we hope that you enjoy it and appreciate it, because I'll be honest, I'm having a very fun time working on this already, because this is like, it's given me an excuse not only to rewatch some of the Muppet stuff that I've already been familiar with, but it's given me a chance to kind of dig into a lot of Jim's earlier stuff that I've seen bits and pieces of, here and there. You can see some of his commercials and short films at the Puppetry Museum in Atlanta, which I've seen, but I really started digging in on this one and watched as much as I could. And there's a lot of good stuff out there, and it's all pretty readily available because, like we said at the beginning of this episode, Jim Henson's archivists are very good at their job.
Yeah.
So they have preserved a lot of this stuff as much as possible. Are you excited for this series?
Oh, I'm so excited for this. And it's so inspiring to see, like, just go for it. Just go do your thing. Live
your dream.
Yeah, live your dream. Just don't wait for the green light. Make your own green light out of felt and ping pong balls.
Yeah.
and just go and do. Yeah.
I hate it.
Oh, well, thanks, Gary. Typical Gary answer.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you guys before we wrap up, though, and this maybe was something we should have talked about at the beginning of the show, but I didn't think about it. But like, what is your experience with the Muppets in general? Like, we've all seen the movies, right? Did you? What about we all grew up watching Sesame Street, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And the Muppet Show, maybe.
A little bit of the Muppet Show.
I think it was on Nick at Night or something when I was a kid, and I would watch it now and then. But I've seen most of it at this point.
We didn't have access to a lot of. We didn't have access to cable, but anytime the Muppets, the movies or anything was on like just regular network television. My parents, who were very religious, they were sucked in, man.
Yeah.
And I told this to you guys maybe last week or recently here, but my father, who was a Vietnam veteran, was not a generally happy man. But one of the things he did, and it made a wrinkle in my brain, I remember him getting 2 socks and putting little marker eyes on them and
Mhm.
ducking down behind the bed and putting on a little Saki and Rocco.
Ah, the
And
rock and sock connection.
yeah. And it was and it's honestly, it is. And I've thought about this a lot recently, just because as we're going through Jim Henson stuff and him talking about his kids and the early stuff and all this, and it's causing me to like reflect. I think it's my earliest and probably fondest memory I have of my dad.
Wow.
And it's just, it was again in a rare, dad wasn't a super silly guy. Like, so for him to do something like this, was pretty wild. And but it was just, it's a key part of my childhood. But getting more into the Muppets, it was fun seeing these, and we'll get into the movies of course later, but even with the the Muppet Show and Sesame Street, having these occasional celebrities come on, and folks that my parents knew, and then of course I got to know them as well. Robin Williams coming on and doing stuff with Elmo and doing stuff with other Muppets, and so many big stars come on to, hey, let's sing a song about letters, or
Yeah, I
let's
mean,
sing a
we'll get
song
into
about...
it when we get to the Muppet Show, but by the time the Muppet Show hit its like peak popularity, like people were begging to be on the show, and they just they had to turn people down because there weren't enough episodes to do it. Like people wanted to be on the Muppet Show. But what I think is interesting, and the reason that we wanted to go back and tell the whole story of Jim Henson, is because so much of what we talked about in this episode, like these commercials, these characters he's creating, these techniques that he's creating, this experimentation that he's doing, these are all seeds that grow into the things that you know Jim Henson for.
Yeah.
The Sesame Street and the Muppets and even Labyrinth and Dark Crystal, like the stuff that he was doing in Europe with the like rudimentary animatronics. That's the very first step towards what he's doing with in like Labyrinth, with like full on robotics.
Yeah.
So it all started very early on, and it just shows you like how innovative he was and how he was always trying to find better ways to do things. So he would start here, but then he'd move it up, and then he'd do it, find a way to do it better, to make it look better, to make the performance better. And he advanced technology and filmmaking in a way that very few other filmmakers have. He is an innovator in ways that very few other people are. Gary, what's your background with the Muppets? Like, because when I started talking to you about this, you were like, I'll be honest, when I was talking about like my ideas for like doing these introductory episodes, I think your response to me was like, I don't know much about Jim Henson other than he's just the nice Muppet man.
Yeah.
But surely,
Well,
I assume you watched, Sesame Street or the Muppet Babies. That was a big one for me when I was a kid.
Yeah, I don't know. I definitely do Muppet Babies. Girl, bye.
Wow, that's a pretty good baby animal there.
That was good. Oh,
Thanks.
man.
No, I think my experience probably doesn't differ too much from a lot of people, that it was started with Sesame Street, but I remember as a kid, like Sesame Street, like just blew my mind.
Yeah.
It just, I'm sure I'll talk more about it once we get there, but just thinking that the Muppets were real, like I was drawn in by how realistic it all was to me, or just like how lifelike they were, I guess. And they seemed to have like actual personality, and I loved them. I loved the Muppets. I had on VHS The Great Muppet Caper and Muppets Take Manhattan.
Yes.
But not the Muppet movie.
But not the Muppet movie,
Just
oddly
the
enough.
sequels. Interesting.
Yeah. And I watched those two movies, I wore those tapes out. Like,
Yeah.
I've seen those movies like a ton of times. Weirdly, not in a while. Like, so it's been at least like 10 years since I've watched them.
Well, it'll be fun to watch them.
Yeah, it'll be fun to watch them again. I still remember them, but I'm excited to like sit down and actually go through them again.
Yeah.
But I still like, but that said, like I remember like from the Muppets Take Manhattan, right now, not having seen that movie in at least a decade, at least, I still remember like together again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's just it's
Classic.
I still remember like the songs and stuff, and like
Somebody's getting married.
yes, somebody's getting married. Yeah, all of that stuff. That's great. I love the Muppets. I would not say that I'm as big a fan as some people. Obviously, I know people that are way more into them than I am, but I would say that I'm above average or above like neutral on them. But I didn't keep up much with their newer stuff, like the stuff that's been coming out since like Disney bought them and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
it's hit or miss, but like the Jason Segel one is actually fantastic, I think.
Yeah.
With the music's written by Brett McKenzie from Flight of the Conchords, it's very good.
Nice. I actually have never seen that one. So.
It's great. I would definitely recommend checking that out. I mean, I'll probably, as we go through all these movies, I'll probably just watch all of them, even the later ones that, from after Jim Henson passed away, which are less good, with the exception of Christmas Carol, which is an obvious classic.
I was a huge fan of Fraggle Rock too. I forgot to mention
man.
that, but I love Fraggle Rock.
I
used to be
love
scared to
Fraggle
death. I was actually gonna stumble into a dimension with giant Muppets chasing me. So
I love Fraggle Rock. That new Fraggle Rock show that's on Apple TV is fantastic as well. It's called Back to the Rock, and it's not like a reboot. It doesn't feel like they're trying to update it for a new generation. It just feels like the next season of Fraggle Rock. Like but some of the technology is a little bit better. Like the dozers look a little bit better because they're updated puppets and stuff. But if you have Apple TV Plus, if you're a fan of Fraggle Rock, check that show out. It's really good. There's a Fraggle Rock live show coming to town in like May. You guys want to go? What if just 40 some odd year old men walk in? Just us, no one else, and no wives are not there, no kids, just us.
3 tickets for Fraggle Rock, please.
We should do it. It's the live version of the new show, so there's going to be live puppetry on stage. I kind of really want to go.
You're like, yeah, but you're not sitting near the kids.
Yeah, you guys are going to have to sit in one of the boxes by yourself, away from everyone. You guys serving beer? Well, fellas, I think that's it for today. I think we've had a good time visiting Jim Henson in Muppet Land, or the early stages of Muppet Land, and we are excited to continue this series. In the meantime, you guys want to tell our listeners where you can be found on the internet?
I am This is Gary Horne on all the things.
My show, Computer Resume Podcast, covering the entire Star Trek franchise in chronological order, is available everywhere and at Computer Resume on all the socials and Patreon. If you like stand-up comedy or if you like Dungeons and Dragons, I host monthly comedy shows as well as an actual play called D's 20, where various performers play D&D in front of a live audience. Info and tickets are available at eventbrite.com, and I'm at Mr. Todd A. Davis on Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd, and D&D Beyond, as long as they behave themselves.
All right, I am at Justin_Bishop on most of those things. I'm also on Blue Sky, as is the show. Cinema_shock on everything else. Also head to cinemashock.net. You can find links to our Discord channel, our merchandise, events. Remember, we have another live show coming up on January 21st where we're going to be screening Who Killed Captain Alex, and I'm just very, very excited for that screening because I think it's going to be a good time. It's going to be so much fun to watch with a crowd. So if you're in the Greenville area, join us. As always, like, rate, and review, and share us with all of your nerdy friends, especially if you got this is a good time to jump in. If you got a friend who's into the Muppets, this episode's a good one for them to get in on the show. And then maybe they can listen to our David Lynch series if they're also a fan of that, because there are people who are fans of both, right? I mean,
we're gonna be, right?
Yeah. So again, that's
laughing politely.
Yeah. Anyway, until next time,
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
and be excellent to each other.
Johnny has the keys. #SaveSesame.